Making Sense, Making Literacies is a series of 3 online CCW Dialogues events, co-created with Wimbledon's 3D Lab. Workshops and exhibition spaces are both sites of making sense, of embodied and cognitive research, usually separated by different points on the production line. The pandemic has upended the historically situational sites of making and showing. Technical workshops at the heart of the Art College are creative labs where ideas evolve and coalesce through experimentation, embrace failings, and collaborative problem solving. These conversations explore the intersubjective and shared spaces of thinking, making, and showcasing through the lenses of staff from the CCW technical team. They provide a reflective space for staff to share experience of learning and teaching making practice and to showcase some of the creative workarounds they've devised over the last year, transferring essential workshop support structures into virtual holding spaces, enabling the student as maker with maker sensibilities wherever they are. Dialogues is a program of events, talks and screenings that take place online during 2021. Devised in collaboration with Camberwell, Chelsea and Wimbledon spaces, Dialogues are hosted remotely and connected via the Chelsea Space platform, which can be found at chelseaspace.org. 3D Lab guest sessions are online technical talks or collaborative workshops hosted by the 3D Lab based at Wimbledon College of Arts. We seek conversations that reflect the richness of thinking through making, technical research and development, and practical learning and teaching. We aim to provide a learning resource and develop an archive for a community keen to articulate tacit knowledge and making literacies that underpin making practice. For previous sessions, please visit wca3dlab.myblog.art.ac.uk or follow us at WCA3DLab on Instagram.
Just to give you a bit of context as to where we are in the series of talks that we have started. Last week we had a panel discussion called Making Sense, Making Literacies, which is the title of these 3 talks. It was a great hour with James Perkins, Fabienne, Lee Perella and Richard Barton, who work across CCW in various different contexts, just sharing a little bit about what making has looked like for them. And there's some really rich and fascinating things that came out of it in terms of just thinking about this current moment where we're at 15 or more months into the pandemic, and thinking really about what practice and making looks like and what the learning environments can possibly look like going forward. But incredibly hopeful discussion with lots of potential and possibility. So if you wanting to feel a little bit encouraged, do try and catch up on that talk. So today we have the pleasure of kickstarting our second session, which has 2 wonderful participants who are close conspirers and colleagues of mine. Will Waterhouse, who is the specialist technician in learning and teaching animatronics and light engineering based at Wimbledon. And we've also got Tyson Howard, who at the time of programming was in the role of studio manager, sculpture and photography program at Camberwell. And mostly of what we would be asking Tyson to do is to reflect on some of his experience of this year in that role. However, he has come joined the A-team down at Wimbledon, and he is part of the 3D Lab team and will be running the 3D Lab with me going forward, which I'm very excited about. We've also got Clare Mitten moderating the session today. So today we wanted to follow on our session from last week, looking at embodied practice in disembodied spaces. And that's really to kind of share about what does making look like in this time? How did we grapple and kind of really wrestle with the challenge of imparting some of making knowledge or tacit knowledge or any kind of embodied making practice in this time over this type of space, so in an online space. With no word of a lie, it was really difficult, and I really just want to commend Tyson and Will for kind of really grappling with it in a very sincere way, with concern for the student learning journey, but also as integral makers themselves, wanting to impart a love of materials, a love of process, and a love of making in a way that's real in a space that's really difficult to do that online. So without further ado, I want to give them as much time as possible to share their practice. And so I'm going to give them a bit of time to share about their context, what making us look for them, some of the challenges. Will very specifically worked on a project with our tech art students down at Wimbledon, looking at how to create automatons, and sort of getting them on the beginning of the journey of thinking about movement. And Tyson was involved in lots of things over the year, and he'll kind of share a little bit about that. But we also wanted to ask him about his pinhole camera project, which kind of saw him ship off all the components for a pinhole camera making project, ship it off to students across the UK and the world, really, to kind of encourage them to explore photography where they were at. So if I could hand over to you, Will, as soon as your video is on and you look raring to go with your cup of tea and biscuit from what I could see.
Hello, thanks Ash. Yeah, so I've got two cameras on, so I guess it's up to you. I can only see my hands little, can't see my face, but just give me a shout if it's blurry or something else. Thanks for organising this, Ash and Claire. I think it's really important to take an opportunity to reflect back and learn from what we have been, where we have been, and take stock so we can kind of take what we want from it and you know, find the good bits and yeah, just learn from our experiences. I kind of very much a maker, and the challenge I found was suddenly losing the 3D space and just having like the verbal and 2D space. So like when I was asked today, I was kind of challenged as to how I might get across my position. So I can say hello upside down there. Hello. Yeah, so I started looking and drawing out kind of what I could learn from the past year, and two things came to light: kind of building a family and keeping it physical. The challenge I had was trying to teach some very intricate movement to a group of students who are disparate and obviously didn't have access to tools that you would normally have. So that was quite a challenge. So when you're trying to teach movement, I wanted the students to feel that embodied movement. So actually have materials in their hands. So immediately reduce the palette to paper, pins, tape. One sec, this isn't working. Ash, I'm just having a technical problem here. You bring Tyson in. I'm going to sort this out. Sorry.
Amazing, no problem. You've got time. Tyson, if we bring you in, would you want to, yeah, even to touch on a bit of this live issue of like, it kind of speaks to where we've been in the last year, isn't it? Like in terms of how difficult it is to share these things, share embodied practice in these formats. Do you want to just share with us where you're at now, and some of the challenges you've had?
Yeah, it's been a long time, isn't it? We've been on these computers talking to little icons of people with no responses. It's becoming quite normal, and I think like that was one of the biggest issues starting off. Where myself, I'm in a management role at the moment, but before that I'm a maker and worked in the workshops for a long time and absolutely loved it. and it was a rethinking about what we actually did. So when students come into the workshop, often it's for like a booked induction or negotiated access where they turn up at the door. The workshop is a space which has to be safe in so many levels. We do risk assessments and all the posh and boring bits and pieces to make sure when they come in they can get on with their project and not really think about it. And we've also got all the tools around us, so we don't really often use that many words in a workshop. It's drawings, it's physical things, picking up nuts and bolts and showing them how a tool works. And to take that away from a technical team who has built that for years and years, that's being how they work, was horrendous. Um, it was the first time when I felt like a TV presenter, and that's not good. It's not good. But we had to keep going, and one of the biggest things that did we found an issue with the students at Camberwell, with particularly with fine art, was they lost the ability to pop to different workshops um, and get that information from all those different people and technicians and bumping into people in the corridors. They lost that starting point, and also their practice, depending on where they live and whatever, it's completely changed. So they had to change their practice, but they didn't have contact of those people and those tools and materials. So myself and Pete, he's a print technician I've worked with many times before, and done some cool stuff with. He was on the print and painting program, and I had the photography and sculpture. We combined forces and collated loads of information which is out there, through everyone's Moodle pages, and there's so much support material that the technicians had done but was hidden. So we pulled all that together, and made a little blog that got us through the first stint of the lockdown, I guess, which was hard. And then the summer came, and we were like, okay, everything's got to go back to normal. But me being a pessimist, I guess, I thought, what if it comes back? And what do we offer the students if it came back? So I work with the photography team, and every year we do an induction with the photography course. And it's based around different academic-led talks. And one's on exposure, and what else have we got? We've got focusing, and it's all based around cameras and the dark rooms and what we do in there. It We didn't have the workshops. If we didn't have the workshops, how would we get the same knowledge across that they would learn to the students? So we broke it down to sort of bare minimum for exposure. We wanted to send them paper, but we couldn't send them chemicals, because that's a whole cosh nightmare. So what we did, we sent them some lumen paper, which didn't have that. We sent them a lens so they can work out how to focus things, and we made several little projects with bare minimum of materials. I know that sounds like a negative, but it's actually a positive. One of the first things I did when lockdown hit, I was like, okay, I'll see if I can make one of these at home. And I've got lots of tools. I know lots of processes, and everything was in my studio, which wasn't at my home. So I'm going around looking for a pair of scissors and sellotape, and it was one of the hardest things I ever made. I made this camera obscura, which became one of the projects we did with them, but it was an absolute nightmare. And I like to think I'm quite a capable maker, and it was frustrating for me. So what we did, we sent them sellotape and different little bits which are the bare essentials to get a project moving, but then they could adapt it and use it in a way that's creative. They understand the process, they understand how something works, and then they can develop it depending on their environment. We had students who made sort of pinhole cameras out of a whole room. They blacked out their windows and did it that way. We had other people who did it with shoe boxes and various different things. So that was quite good fun. But it was a tricky thing, and especially where we've, as a university, we know what we like to do. You know, I'd love to teach people how to make things all day long in a lovely workshop. We know that, but with the, I'm going to sound negative here, but things are changing and moving on, and we're kind of clinging on to a way of working which might not be as relevant. And I think things keeping a bit of both, and this blended learning has actually made room and space for us to move things online to make more sense of in-depth, hands-on stuff, and we can go into deeper knowledge with that in the workshop space. It frees us up for that, and also these online projects are something that they're going to keep this year, no matter what, which has been a real positive. And who knew that was going to happen?
I know you think you've been negative, Tyson, but actually that is incredibly positive, isn't it? And it's really hopeful. And I think that's what we wanted to kind of capture in these sessions, is a snapshot of this, of really harnessing the disruption that we've experienced in this time, that actually it's dislodged us from thinking making happens in these very specific areas. And actually someone can't cut a piece of wood if they haven't got access to a workshop, or they can't do this because they haven't got access to that. But also to put ourselves in that position of frustration, that actually that was a very level, flattened experience, wasn't it? We've all been taken out of our comfort zones in some shape or form. Part of what we wanted to explore more so in our next session, which is about enabling practice, like how do we enable people to make where they're at. I wondered if you could share a little bit about like the hope for the next space that we're moving in from, you know, the battle of being completely online to now where we're kind of really hitting the road running a little bit more in terms of thinking about what the blended space looks like. How do we use and harness the benefits of being able to have these calls, these chats online, and how could that kind of help us going forward in a making sense? Being a maker yourself as well, what do you see the opportunities?
I think in terms of communication, we were, the workshop staff were behind a door, as welcoming as we tried to be. Students had to find us, and we would signpost them there and stuff like that. And we would always we'd ask them to bring a drawing. Generally, they wouldn't, and we would set up a space so they could draw for us. You know, over the years, I've had people read poems to me about a piece that they wanted to make to try and articulate it. It's having the internet at your fingertips is a wonderful thing, and being able to share images of as you're talking. It's surprising how local we are as a community when we're on site. So if a student needs materials, we'll tell them where to go buy it, what shops relevant, and all that sort of stuff. But during this lockdown, people were all over the world and trying to explain, you know, translate things, which might be a component like a wing nut or something like that. We don't know where they can get it from, but if we could share an image, they know what they're looking for. You know, images, yeah. I think language is one of the things which has been exposed as our weak link, I think, within technical almost. Articulation of that. We are quite physical things, and making them and showing people how to make things, that's our bag really. And that's where this computer kind of sits. It can translate, it can show images a lot quicker, and make it easier for people to find things. So I think we will use it, and I think it's just making sure people engage with it. So we were pinging about links as well, pinging all those. We'd have a conversation, and it will be either in a Teams chat or an email or on Collaborate or something like that. And there was all this information which wasn't actually pulled together of a conversation we had. So that was another issue I was having, was repeating myself to the same student. And could you send that link again? So I started making these. I'm gonna pitch the old sway again to everyone. I don't have commission from doing this, but I should, because I think I'm doing well selling it. It's part of the 365 thing, and you can throw all the links and pictures and videos in there, and it stays a live document, and it's lovely. So you can, both you and the group of students can feed into it as well, because it has multiple editors. It's lovely, and it stays in one place forever. Yeah.
I think you've picked up on like really, language is an interesting one, isn't it? Like Clare in the chat has just said different modes of communication and thinking, the distinction between spoken, written language and visual languages of making, drawing, and almost to have some sense of agreed notion of what those are. And a part of what we've gone through in the lab is just articulating that. And James Perkins is on the call as well, and he was in our session last week, and he knows firsthand of us really trying to articulate what these making literacies are, and actually using some of his workshops with his students to prototype a different way of talking, of speaking, of trying to understand what we do in the physical. Because tacit knowledge is just that, it's tacit, it's knowledge by touch as opposed to articulation in some shapes. So just to kind of remind everyone of the definition we put up last week is the making literacies working definition that's kind of live, but I wonder if this starts to help us share a little bit of a common language, as it were. So making literacy is the ability to play, explore, understand, interpret, create, communicate, and make sense of the world using materials and processes across digital and analog fabrication. And then we just had these few different ways of thinking about what does it mean to be literate. And really, this is for us as much as for students, really. How do we understand properties and materials as much to then speak about them in a kind of virtual environment? And then I guess secondly, your categorization of information, that's really important, isn't it? In terms of making sense. As soon as we flung into the internet and the world of the internet, we've suddenly got everything at our fingertips. And you spoke of something like in terms of giving people the handles for them to then explore wherever they're at. So, you know, pinging them an image of a wing nut, and then they've got that kind of idea of what that is, where they can find it. And last week we talked about the sort of affinities with material, but also engaging people with their locality as makers. So enabling people to be makers where they're at. And I think that illustration of the pinhole camera project is wonderful, when you just send them these key little components and actually you're forcing people to be enabled in some way, to be curious, to be kind of testing these things out.
It's actually weirdly, which came from it, it actually supported them being more creative. So you know, we would show them a process before. They would understand all the terminology. They got all of that from, rather than a whole workshop, they got the same knowledge and experience, but with probably a bit more diversity and outcome from a tiny little lens being sent to them and a bit of tape, and that was probably something. Yeah, we would never have done that without being forced, really, to rethink about how we look at things and how we approach them.
I I think very quickly early on, we kind of likened our experience to Apollo 13 of like talking about gaffer tape and plastic sheeting and anything that people could find. But we were still in that moment of sort of almost didactic transfer, or like do this, do that, when actually we needed to not only translate our experiences online, but we needed to transform our experiences online. So actually moving into this space where we're in a different space now, aren't we? Because we were fully physical, then bang, fully online. And then now we can, this is kind of timely to have these conversations because it's kind of making sense of this moment of where we're going. And I think there's something about that, understanding how much we give and what's the scaffolding for these making environments, and what is the, I think Richard Barton's on the line as well, and he's mentioned situated kind of making, being kind of dislodged, as it were, like, or challenged, that we don't necessarily need these sites of making, but we need to figure out what it is to enable students to be makers where they're at. I see Will's back. I can see Will's back in the room, and I think this would be a really key moment to bring Will in, because you've really grappled with this, haven't you? Especially with our tech art student.
Yeah, it's that playing, being kind of giving people like that permission to play, but also giving them the toolkit to play with, and obviously teaching movement and teaching repetitive movement. So, you know, to be using a servo motor or to be using a crank handle, something that's so like formulaic and repetitive, is obviously very tech heavy. So there was this need to free that up, to take away. Your mind can get boggled thinking about hardware and equipment, and you know, you've got to learn about you know, electricity coding, just basic mechanics. So I was grappling with not only the fact that that's a complication, but there's also our student body is also mentally in a difficult place right now, and how do you deliver that without overloading them? So I spent quite a lot of time trying to find ways of getting it in, trying to find ways of getting materials in students' hands, engaging them, and I found quite a few ways to try and get people to play. Even with, like, we had a project, I think you used it at Ash as well, which is like building a tower. How high can you get? Different ways of trying to create some kind of shared goal, some kind of community, some kind of shared project, and get materials in hands. That was a real challenge. One of the ways I tried to keep it light was I tried to kind of really try and understand what knowledge I was putting across and making it accessible. One way of doing that was just by using less words, putting images in, putting objects in where maybe the technology is telling you to do otherwise. So that was one way I found that was really I hope it gave life to things for other people. I printed out some kind of demonstrations. It's nothing fancy, but like one project was a coat hanger into a crank, which was quite a light touch idea. Another was playing around with the difference between toys and automaton. So automaton's either quite prescriptive, and and quite technically challenging. And so that's where I wanted to end up. But I started off kind of creating a Padlet. Padlet was a wonderful tool for this. Padlet was a wonderful tool for uploading content and creating a bank of imagery and moving images. And GIFs fell into that nicely, I would say. Teaching movement, it's all about, you know, videos don't really cut it. The technology couldn't really hack everybody live streaming, so GIFs were a way of uploading that information. So to start with, it was like as an icebreaker and also getting people to understand movement. I came up with the idea of this little kind of figure on a stick, which allowed everybody's interpretation to be slightly different, but built around quite a strict framework. It's a little figure. It's on a stick. It's on a pencil, and it would move, and depending on where you attached it, it would move in a different way. And then we talked about adding sound, adding music, and documenting well as well. That was the other thing, because they're going to be documenting stuff and sending it in to be assessed. I talked a lot about how you might want to think about documenting it and making the most out of that movement. Also, I was trying to engage with using GIFs and Padlet. I always find there's a journey that is the values in the journey, or the value is in the outcome, and I was trying to marry those two together. And I wanted to create a project where it was an in. We all had the materials to do so, but really what I wanted to do, which I don't think I got, was to create some kind of document at the end which would have value in its own right. I imagined like a rave or a disco of little paper men all dancing to the same music or different, whatever it might be. I was hoping for that to kind of, I was hoping for that to be handed over in some way. So that kind of leads on to something I found out probably a little bit too late, and that was this new team dynamic we knew nothing about really. So we're all online. I'm trying to get people to turn their cameras on, so I feel like we're not shouting into a void. I know this is old hat now. We're talking, you know, this has been well talked about, but I'm going to get on to where I was, but actually I've just segue into something else. So that with getting the people to turn their cameras on, I played a game whereby we would create a camera shutter. So from that, they would learn something mechanical. So we'd talk about how to slide or turn, something that would conceal your camera. That would be maybe a conniving way to get people to engage with their cameras. But they'd learn something about movement, about how to slide something, and about that ease of slide, or whether it be a flap. It just gives them something to think about. The other thing on that trajectory was talking about what that shutter might be, and whether that shutter might have a color, or whether it might be transparent, or that it have all these tonal qualities. So then again, going back to that multiples, I kind of had a vision of a patchwork quilt. So all of our, rather than looking at your team's meeting and everyone's got their initials, you'd have your camera on as default, and you'd have this kind of patchwork of color. So another way of trying to soften that interface. Yeah, and I don't think these interfaces are made for makers. And even setting up today, I haven't been here for a little while because I've been back in the workshop. I was even thinking about how actually, I actually went and got a mirror from the from the bin, in terms of like, rather than changing my camera, I'd tilt the mirror so I could see me or see the camera, because I'm finding the digital is overloading with default analog creatures. So if you can swap out some digital for analog, for myself, I find that super helpful. I mean, there's a camera attachment to the ceiling, but every time I try, and I've not given up the battle to be kind of a Zoom literate or Collaborate ultra literate. I find it quite interesting.
Yeah, I just think that's a helpful point there, just because it showcases a bit of your grappling. And I just think there was value in that, because you're trying to disrupt these technologies and these tools that we have available to us in order to make them maker interfaces. And just as Claire put in the chat, this kind of question of, you know, what might a maker interface using the tools that we have available to us, what might that look like? And I think in the session last week, it was kind of, I think it was raised towards the end of the chat, is just how do we disrupt these tools or dirty them in a way, just like you would have greasy hands at the end of a day in the metal shop, or, you know, to use them not as these clean interfaces that are set up for presentations and conferencing, but in ways that kind of actually enable our practice. And to do so, you sort of have to grapple with the insuitability or unsuitability that they have in order to see the other side.
Yeah, I really feel like I need the big. I just kind of like want to get in the room with the big tech companies and like, how can you assist? You know, I'm not in an office. I love the whiteboard capacity to share things on whiteboard. But actually, during this lockdown, I had a whiteboard on my wall, and that was the best way for me to kind of talk through ideas with students. I should say that actually, like, I was very privileged. I'll just put this round. I was very privileged to have, this is my my workbench here. So I had all this like at my disposal, and more through there, but the lead's only short, so I'm not going to go through there. So I was very fortunate to have my personal workshop up and running to help students, although I still had to be very aware that they didn't. So I had to be working with in a medium that they could use. But this largely was a mental struggle, really. And one of my sessions, which was probably very dry, talking about motors, you know, going through different things, I actually stuck an image of a knitting needles and a ball of wool, because I referenced craftivism, which was kind of like a movement that whereby through the act of making you discuss. So it's merely like a social lubricant, the process to enable you to talk. And a bit like if you ever want to get any, you know, get something out of somebody, if they're struggling to verbalize what they're going through, a good way is to go into a car and take them for a drive. You're not making eye contact, you've got something to do. There's different tricks, ways of getting social groups working. And in this arena, it was really tricky. And I found out too late that, because I didn't know this group of students, I didn't know their dynamic. I found out too late that what they needed was to know each other. And a bigger part of our role was actually to enable the students to meet. So at that point, I merely hosted their meetings at one point, and I was kind of in the background. And I enabled that by making breakout groups. They would go, and I would give them a task to either introduce or talk through something, very much feeling our way. And they came back to the group, and I didn't know, but you know, they said, "Oh, I've made a friend." That's what's happened right now. And then I became engaged with the written side of their course. They had papers to write, So I said, listen, I'm going to host a discussion for you. I'm not going to necessarily even be part of it, but I put this date in the diary. We will meet and we will chat. And while we do so, here's an optional project. And we would create a project just with wire, and we'd create a hinged man doing something with the inspiration from Alexander Calder's Circus, which is a very charming, brilliant performance piece. And sure enough, I just then the dynamic opened up.
That was something that was picked up last week about the incredible importance of well-being, and that actually making is sort of central to that. And when we were running our making literacy intro sessions with our first years, you know, there was a question of why do we make, and there was a lot of like mechanical answers. You know, we make to kind of realize something, to realize a design, to explore materiality, to transfer materials into other materials, you know, but actually fundamentally most of the responses from students were we make to make sense of the world, but also to make sense of ourselves. And also there's a, you know, it's relaxing, it's distressing, it's core to our well-being, which was quite an interesting that actually you've picked up on that, and we're very conscious, and I must say are very conscious even pre-pandemic about the nature of mental health, and being aware of how much we are, you know, being aware of the student journey, but also being aware of how we hold space. I can see Tyson wanting to come in there.
Yeah, I would just in terms of making being relaxing, and I love to make things, and it's enjoyable thing I do, but it's kind of just like people going out on a bike and go for a nice long bike ride. But if it's your first go on a bike and your first experience is falling off and hurting yourself, which often the students, it's their first ever time making something. If it's not enjoyable, we've lost them. We've lost that engagement and that want to get to the point where it is lovely. I was chatting to Will a bit earlier about like growing up, we had things like Blue Peter and Art Attack and stuff like that. And Art Attack used to really frustrate me because he always had that kitchen paper and PVA. I didn't have kitchen paper and PVA at home, so I couldn't join in. So I just watch him make lovely things, and you're like, okay, great. I can't do that. But there's another program called Bitzer, which that used to make stuff out of rubbish in the bin. I could do that, and it was quite open. So if anyone's got any time, Google that because it's worth a watch. I know these are kids' TV programs, but when you're making things, they kind of relate.
And I think that really much speaks to I think the desire on the 3D lab point to really articulate approaches to making, and the making literacies, because there, you know, I guess we noticed that there's a massive inequality as to what people had access to in this time, and so, but actually making is for everyone. So how do we teach curiosity, teach an approach to what is in front of you, as opposed to say, this is a very particular material, we want you proficient in this material. How much does that enable that student or that maker to make, when actually, you know, it's that, what's a teach a man to fish sort of thing. But you're quite right, like if you don't have those materials to hand, but if we teach the approach, or and I guess it comes back to what is that learning environment, like how much or what do we give a student for them to feel capable, confident, enabled?
And one thing you could do is take away their expectation of creating something shiny and brilliant. You know, quite often a good idea will sit really well made out of a pile of mud. You know, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't. That's probably not best said, but I do think, and it comes back to play again. and also like that documentation. If you present something as something and I mean, especially animatronics. If you do that bad, it's bad. It's really bad. um, if you frame it like it's the uncanny valley, you know, you can't get there. You want to create a human, all moving, singing, dancing, robotic face. It's just terrible. So just that's the joy of art. You create your own category. You create your own judge and jury, and you just look for the conviction in your own doing.
Claire just mentioned about, you know, maybe we think of play as something anyone can do innately, but it is something that begins as being facilitated and in a safe space. And I think, Will, you're brilliant at you're a designer, you're an artist, but your knowledge of materials and mechanics and engineering is phenomenal. And it's just interesting to see how you deconstruct these fairly large and intricate principles of making. And you do it in a way that's accessible, playful, and hopefully the students are benefiting from that. I certainly do, as being a colleague of yours, and being challenged to kind of see play for the value that it is. And I think it speaks much to what you said earlier about those documents you were wanting to create, of seeing the value in the journey as much as seeing the value in the outcome. But also trying to have a kind of a bit of a marriage between the two. And I think maybe play is a bit of a glue system in that.
It needs elevating, that word.
Mm.
It's just too dismissive, but it's everything, you know. And the ability to fail, like that's just a lesson learned, you know. And you just need courage to go headlong into something you know nothing about, and get you know, perceived like pie on your face, but actually you just learned something because that's the only way. Yeah, so to create a place you can be silly on as well. That was like you know, I often just kind of, you know, go to bed feeling like cold sweats, like oh god, I've just behaved like Uncle Will, you know, by just trying to create a space where you can say the wrong thing. You could throw a question out and not be feeling like you're going to be judged. And that was actually a huge, which I didn't realize at the time, but I think that was a huge part of, you've got a lot of young adults in a room, a virtual room, who don't know each other well enough to make those mistakes. And so really, we were the only ones who could hold that space and create that space where they could meet, because they haven't got a team hierarchy yet. They don't know each other well enough to formulate. You know, anyone sticks their neck out and says, "Come along to my meeting." You know, you likely go, "Oh, you know, fit. You know, this is who put you in charge." But we have that authority as employees of the institution. So it's really it was something that I just had to discover. But I just think that's the beginning point of something really powerful. I just thought, leading on from that, creating that bigger family, one thing that I instigated was to get Paul Bloom from the library to talk about kit bashing in tech arts. Now, kit bashing is a very real way. I mean, you know, anyone who loves Star Wars, I'm not that bothered, but people love it. That these industries just have like that long to create something. They have to be ingenious, kind of creative, playful, if you like, and take what's there and make something new out of it. Paul Bloom knows a hell of a lot about that, and he's very talented. Other than he works in the library. He's brilliant on the computers, but no one knows he's a maker, and it's to extend that family as well, and to get that knowledge. That was lovely to be able to pull Paul into the loop. And I think that strange thing, when we're all so disjointed, actually I made more connections across job families, for the official term, then I have, open up different doors, which was really, an oxymoron for the situation.
Yeah, that came up in our first session actually about breaking down silos, and I think all of our panel members last week were kind of mentioning the benefits of being able to kind of cross paths with other programs or other staff, family potentially on different courses, and just why hasn't that happened before? And maybe we needed these disruptions in this time in order to do that. I think you also picked up on something that I find really interesting as someone who runs workshops and is interested in the flow of and articulating all these activities that aren't really written on the tin. And I think we are custodians of holding space for students, helping them float through these times of kind of complexity and challenge and sort of mental health anxieties, like one of the massive challenges on the rise. And it just, as you were speaking there, Will, kind of reminded me of communities of inquiry. This kind of social learning theory that you need aspects of, you need a kind of learning sphere, teaching sphere, and a social space. And that you need to kind of overlap them in some shape or form, and they may be seen as one of the other, but they're elements. And actually, as workshops, as makers, maybe we don't articulate that as much. They, certainly in workshops as CCW, they're sites of crossover where people may be working alongside another student from another course, and actually it's just interesting to take stock and for you to kind of name that and articulate it and go, hey, where are we actually intentionally kind of structuring and creating the architecture for these things to happen? Name the value in these aspects of the spaces that we're involved in, whether that's virtually or physically.
I think I've like we were saying, we're working across different groups of people and stuff like that. That's all I've done all my life, is collected people who are amazing. Yeah, just amazing, got loads of skills. And unfortunately for them, I've kept their numbers, and Teams has made it easier to contact them. I know when they're looking at a screen now. So it just having, we work at CCW, and it's there's so many clever people available, and a lot of the times what we do day to day, our teaching and stuff is the first level of that person, and that's their kind of default position. But once we get to know them and stuff like that, they've got so much knowledge and so much years of experience and stuff, and quite often not in the specialism you expect them to. But just keeping hold of them, and the community has got me out of so many sort of questions from students, because I know someone who can fix it. If I don't know, yeah, I've probably created more work in other people's inboxes than I've had. But everyone's been really good and really generous with it. Yeah, I just think that's how we can be better at what we do, is actually make sure the questions being fired at the right person, and the right questions being asked.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, you've done exactly that for me, Tyson, and got me in to help with students at Camberwell, and I think the that that was only possible or easier because of the situation where geographically I mean nothing. I just I'm at the end of a line, so um, yeah, it's understanding who does what and signposting them.
Being online has brought everyone weirdly together if you know who the person is you want. And I'm quite lucky. I've worked across Wimbledon and Camberwell, and know a lot of people and done a little bit of time over at Chelsea as well. So I'm aware of everyone who's about. But if we've got a better way of showing that to our students as well, um, yeah, we'll be doing all right, won't we?
I think that's really hopeful, and maybe that speaks into maybe the disembodied spaces weren't so disembodied after all. That actually it was a way of trying to, maybe that dichotomy of thinking about embodied practice and feeling the loss of our physical spaces and our comforts, as it were, in trying to have things to kind of show students and actually be. I just miss being able to draw on the same piece of paper with a student. I think whiteboard on Teams just doesn't quite cut the mustard in the same way. But in the same score, James mentioned a book, Blind Giant, Nick Harkaway, and the quote is, "We're going to drag the digital into contact with the mud." And I think that's a really interesting kind of visceral image of going, well, hey, like we are analog creatures, like you say, Will, but we're also, we can harness these tools in some way. We can disrupt them, we can dirty them, we can bring them and harness. What are these connections that can be made? How do we promote togetherness in this way, and maybe use it as a way to kind of break down silos or break down the barriers, and maybe share the problems that we're experiencing, sharing the challenges that we're experiencing. We've gone 0 to 60 in a short space of time, but it's really fascinating just to kind of capture some of your responses. And I think you've pulled on so many kind of interesting things that we really need to take heed and harness and remember, because I think very quickly we can move on to this next phase of going, just facing the next challenge of what the next term might bring us, because actually we don't know. We might, hopefully we won't be in another full lockdown situation, but I think from now on, we're going to be living with reduced capacities in some shape or form, or different ways of working that we need to incorporate. I wondered if you could, just offer up any kind of notion of where do you think making practice is going to go now, with all the disruptions that we've had so far. What do you see? What are the hopeful? Tyson, I know you started by saying you're very pessimistic, but I think you're the opposite. You're hopeful for potential and possibility, and I think there's a real driving motivation there. Do you want to just maybe share some sort of projections as to where we can go as makers, as educators, as people interested in the physical making world?
I would like to think I'd like to think we won't send everyone through to have a look at the workshops or have a go at the workshops as a token gesture, and actually offer people a real opportunity to come in and time and space to play and figure out their practice, and give people an overview of the spaces and what we have to offer. But yeah, just open up that space to more than just these are the facilities and everyone who comes on site should have a look at them. Yeah, I think giving them, I'd like to think there's going to be more making and more in-depth learning of making over the next few years, and hopefully a bit of collaboration across CCW, which we've always struggled to do, but hopefully this will give us a bit of time to do that as well, and a bit of freedom to start again, because we've always built on an old model of an art education of the workshops, and lots has changed in the world.
Yeah, more time to play, and I think what you're saying there for me feels like almost a deeper, even more embodied practice, because we understand the value of the physical and we understand the value of these digital tools, as it were. But everything's technology, really. A piece of wood's a technology. You know, Teams is a technology. How do we exploit and disrupt and use and capitalize or harness all these pieces of kit, really, to advance our inquiry? But I think what my soul is singing out there, Tyson, is this: there seems to be hopefully an aspect of like a deeper connection to what we're actually doing, being more conscious makers. I know we've spoken about that in our lab sessions with our makers and our artists, really grappling with what this cultural moment is doing to their practice or has disrupted in their practice. And there seems to be an element of people really wanting a kind of conscious connection to why they're making the materials they're using, and their place in the world, as it were. Will, do you want to just offer up, like, you know, what do you think are some of the hopeful things going forward, given the context that we've had and the challenges that we've had, and where we're going now?
Well, I hope to hold on to some of these relationships of job. What did you say? Silos, breaking down silos. I think technically we can function very well as in our natural state as technicians. Someone comes to you and you've learned how to kind of mine their knowledge that they're trying, you know, get their words out. You can help them on a one-to-one basis in a very rich and effective way, which I think is often not quite understood. The kind of that ability that you learn how you help someone say, well, they don't know how to communicate it, how to help them communicate it even. However, we could carry on being super like rich and valuable like that, but we also now have been kind of forced to look at things from the other side. We've kind of had a leveling, and I've never been so involved in like unit briefs, actually understanding you know, what course are sending the students this way if they are. I feel like we can be more informed, and also we can hold a room better because we've had to. So I feel like we can not just use the workshops how I just described, although I think that often that is overlooked, and I think there's such a richness in that, although it might not be unit driven necessarily. But I feel we can use the making spaces and instigate kind of extra curriculum or curriculum based projects that we can drive and we can put our stamp on from the perspective of like our material knowledge and making knowledge. So so I feel like coming out of it, there's more structure. Now, I don't think necessarily that's an entirely good thing. I think it's something to be aware of, and don't put structure in for structure's sake. But we can, if we're clever, we can use that to create an additional educational space.
I think there's some really key moments in there, or beats, in the sense of thinking about scaffolding. You know, what is a good, again, it's that question of what are these learning spaces, and how do we construct them in really effective ways to help people kind of sit with complexity and be able to navigate change and explore and innovate, and make sense of their briefs as well. But how do we do that, as you know, with that leveling? That's it was kind of mentioned last week in our last session as well, in terms of just that with those working relationships. We are in an institution where there are natural hierarchies, but I think it's been disrupted enough for us to really see some benefits in breaking down some of those hierarchies, or seeing where hierarchies may be useful in some areas and not other areas. So no, I think that is something definitely of value. You know, thinking about the learning experience, but then also just thinking about how we actually operate and have permission to operate and collaborate. James has come in saying making structures work for us and work for the students, workshop thinking in studio spaces, and vice versa, and projects led by anyone and everyone. There's always space for them within existing units and briefs. And I think, James, you've definitely challenged me to come in and work with your students in really new and sometimes uncomfortable ways, because you're kind of grappling with the topics at hand in a very live way. You know, there's a sense that something is worth exploring, and then suddenly, you've got a session in the calendar and you've got to kind of really make sense of it and be able to deliver it in some sort of cohesive way. I'm going to bring in Clare now, just to kind of, as our kind of moderator and orchestrator of these conversations. And Clare's been working with us for a number of years and is a real champion of our practice, and but also cementing that idea of exactly that workshop thinking in studios, but in gallery spaces, and gallery thinking in workshops and studios, and that kind of change up of sites of research and making sense. So I just want to hand over to Clare. Maybe you've been capturing some ideas or some responses that you can share with us.
Oh, thanks, Ash. Yeah, no, I think, the key thing is the emphasis on like play and process for me are really exciting, and just, I guess the online shift is an opportunity to kind of refocus the lens, or put it somewhere else, isn't it, on those kind of making practices. I think, yeah, like a few key things that have come up for me are that the different, Tyson, you talked really beautifully about the difference between, the workshops. Usually they're such a practical making space, and you work with visual language of diagrams and drawings and communicating through those visual kind of methods or making methods, and how different sort of spoken word and language is, and how that, that's a different part of the brain. So it's a completely different way of thinking. So how to kind of suddenly have to kind of do the same job or perform the same sort of role with a different part of the brain, or communicate in a different way is yeah, it's really difficult. And they are separate. They're separate ways of thinking that are kind of integrated in interesting ways, maybe.
I- just in like a lot of people have got into sort of gardening over lockdown, and you don't often start by learning the Latin for every plant name. You just pick a plant that's pretty and hopefully water in it and it stays alive. If it doesn't, you've learned something. But it's kind of getting the balance right between the language. Yeah, normally that kind of comes after when we're in a workshop, the language, but I think it's given us a bit of a chance to rethink actually what we're talking about, and what we're doing, on a more of an academic level and awareness of the briefs and stuff.
Yeah, but they're both equally valid, and equally important. That, again, that, yeah, leveling is the wrong word, but just recognizing, I guess, the value of both of those languages in different ways. I think that, yeah, the other thing that struck me was something about a nostalgia, and maybe, this I guess the paradox of being online and the high tech, enabling us to have the facility during lockdown to be able to continue in some way with learning and making and doing stuff. But at the same time, the kind of making we're going back to and valuing are, that kind of Blue Peter, or using the lo-fi stuff around us. And yeah, it made me think of that sort of paradox of high tech lo-fi, and your Apollo 13 reference was of that vein as well. And, and tools, and using the laptop as a tool. I don't know if you remember Doug O'Connell, who used to work at Wimbledon. I remember he used to carry his laptop round, and it was just so battered and covered in, like, all sorts of mess and paint and chipped and dented. And it was just refreshing, because he used to, he was like, it's a tool, I use it as a tool. It was this kind of everyday object rather than this kind of precious, clean kind of bit of kit.
The term making literacies, just as you were speaking there, Claire, that actually it is about language, but it's also about articulating what makes up the language of making. And so actually it seems just totally key to go, hey, there are such a thing as making literacies. We can be literate in making just as we are literate in language and other bits and pieces. So it just seems like a really helpful point, or I think that's the beauty of and the gift of these sessions, is to say there's value here, there is some gold here, let's snapshot it, have a moment to kind of reflect on it, very generously made by Claire, to give us that space. So thank you, Claire, for kind of just giving us the opportunity to kind of, just to take a moment and go, this happened and this is how we responded, and actually these are some of our learnings, which I think we just wouldn't have had pre-pandemic, pushing through these thresholds of pain and discomfort and frustration. Although it's been a horrendous year, it's done phenomenal light years of work in change, development and management, in an institution that doesn't change very quickly. But actually it's helpful for us to take a moment and go, this is valuable, like let's try and maybe not at the speed at which we have done, but let's try keep chipping away at figuring out or articulating and naming. I think the process of naming is just as important as anything else, really. Naming a tool and naming its function helps us understand it as much as using it, really.
About how we use things as well. Like, I keep thinking, I think it was James, I think you, if you're there last week, were talking about, just having the laptop or the screen open as a window, and just like, something about the scrutiny of the gaze when we sit right in front of it. And Tyson, I think you talked, and Will, about feeling like a TV presenter. This kind of performative role, and maybe it doesn't need to be like that. Maybe it's about I don't know, a kind of community, or more of a kind of casual screen. I don't know. Don't know how you get rid of the voyeur kind of trickiness of cameras in private spaces. It's a weird one.
Well, they're everything, aren't they, right now? And if money wasn't an issue, you could. I'd quite like to just spend. I'd like to spend time. What would happen if we put a fisheye camera in the corner of the room, and that is our only way of interacting? What would happen to that group of 10 people in that room at that time? You would engage in a different way. It's always like, I can remember when the iPad came out, having, why no, it's not going to catch on, and it's just that slight difference creates a completely different user interaction with it. So it's really, especially as makers, how to use this technology. It's really quite crude for what we could be doing with it, I feel.
Yeah, it's curiosity and play, isn't it? It keeps coming back to that. Like, I wonder what would happen if, I did this.
Yeah.
What would it be like? Like, or I really want to see what this would look like. Yeah.
Well, I think we're coming to our end there, but I think there's some really beautiful key articulations in there. So I just want to really thank you, Will and Tyson. I've worked with you in this year, but I've also just observed as a colleague and as someone going through similar experiences, I've just observed how well you have grappled with it, and that there's been such value in you mining how you show up in these spaces, the way you use these technologies, and always keeping this golden thread of really valuing and honouring the student learning journey, and also this passion to enable the student as maker wherever they're at. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of publicly take a moment and say thank you very much. And it's been really inspiring to see your response. And I think I'm so lucky that you guys are on the 3D Lab team, and looking forward to doing this next season together to see where we go. I think there's immense possibility and hope in a very sincere way. I think that was my word last year, even in January, and it was a sense of this kind of gritty, real, brutal reality facing hope that you can face the kind of craziness of this time, but there is a sense of hope and a golden thread that actually good will come of it, and it has done, in the sense of us just actually naming and articulating the value in our processes, in making spaces and in our approaches, and also just alleviating some of that pressure of being perfect, and actually showing some of showing those corners of practice that are messy and disruptive. So thanks to Will, thanks to Tyson for your time today, and thanks to Clare again for just bestowing just a really valuable time for us to generously look into these things and record these conversations. Thanks for your time. I hope that was helpful, and we'll see you next time.